Hello and welcome to my bowl game predictions. Now, I kind of pick and chose from this. There are some unranked games that I chose and some obviously ranked games that I chose, but honestly, I just ignored teams and games that I didn't know a whole lot about and games that I knew, and I chose games that I knew more about. And let's get right into it. So first off, we have UTSA versus Troy. Troy kind of slaughtered their competition against Coastal Carolina, and UTSA did too. These teams are both teams that look like they kind of ran the table. They dominated in their conferences. Now, obviously, they have two losses. One of Troy's losses is to Ole Miss. At Ole Miss, it's a 10-28, which, that's a pretty bad loss, 18-point game. Now, I will say it is at Ole Miss, so that's all the difference. And I don't know. I didn't really look at the stats. It looks like even Ole Miss had more turnovers. Actually, Troy had 346 yards of total offense. So, I don't know. Then they lost at Appalachian State. Appalachian State they were doing very good for a while, and then they kind of fell apart and lost. They just started to lose games. And, Appalachian State was a much better team than their record says. Whereas on UTSA's side, UTSA lost in triple overtime to Houston, and then they got their ass kicked by Texas at Texas. Actually, not really. I mean, 21 points is kind of like a ass kick, but not really. So both teams have played like actual Power 5 conference schools pretty decently. So I see more potential in Troy. It's going to be a close one. These two teams are going to butt heads. I'm going to give it to Troy. I just think Troy wins. I just think Troy was more explosive and more energetic in their bowl game than UTSA was. Cincy versus Louisville, all the backgrounds are going to be football. I just couldn't be asked to find pictures of every team. It'd just be too much. Cincy versus Louisville. I'm going to give this one to Cincy. I mean, Louisville, let's be real. Their best win was a win against number 10 Wake Forest. And Wake Forest had 8 turnovers in that game, which led to their demise, of course. And that was really what got Louisville a lot of clout. And their win over a hobbled NC State at Louisville. That was the only reason they ever got ranked. And then as soon as they got ranked, they got beaten up by, well, not really beaten up, but also kind of handled by Kentucky. There was never a moment in the game where Louisville led. In fact, the furthest point spread was 7-26. So, Louisville is just to me, a little bit overrated. I mean, they lost to Boston College. They did barely lose to Florida State, but they also almost lost to UCF. And I just think Cincinnati's the better team here. I do think this is going to be a good matchup, but I believe Cincinnati will just make more explosive plays, maybe like a pick six or something like that. Something's going to happen to give Cincinnati a bigger point spread. SMU versus BYU. I don't know why I did this one so high up. It's like way down there. SMU versus BYU. SMU has played. They've played actually more impressive this year. SMU played TCU to 8 points at SMU, of course, but TCU is number 3 in the country right now. 1 loss to Kansas State in the Big 12 championship. I mean, hey, that props to SMU, but BYU also beat Baylor. Yes, at BYU, but Baylor's, 6-6, but they're not a bad football team. And that was definitely a game that BYU mainly controlled for the majority. So I'm going to actually say BYU is going to kind of dominate here. To me, it just looks like from the rest of the resume, BYU is the better team. They played Notre Dame to 8 points at Notre Dame. SMU has taken some pretty bad losses. They've been crushed a couple times. They've also had an insane shootout where they just show that their defense isn't a major problem. And yeah, I just think BYU is a better team. Washington State versus Fresno State. I did FRSU because I didn't want to do FSU and be like Florida State. I don't know. Whatever. Washington State is all about their defense. Fresno State, we've seen some potential from Fresno State. They took down Boise State, won their thingy, and they'll get Washington State. I'm going to say Washington State's going to shut this team down. One, because Washington State's got a good defense, but their quarterback and their offense can actually get something done. Like, let's be real, in the Washington State-Washington game, Washington State was playing possession after possession against Washington and basically just shut down in the fourth quarter offensively and they just weren't able to pull through and score, which led to Washington dominating and dropping a lot of points on them. But Washington State is a very defensive team. They're very good in the defense. And I just don't know if Fresno State's going to be able to outlast their defense. And versus Washington State's offense versus Fresno State's defense is just, to me, I think Washington State should just be able to maintain Fresno State and score points. Florida State versus Oregon State. Personally, I feel like Oregon State is getting absolutely robbed. They're number 14 in the country, and they got 6-6 Florida. I feel like, personally, they're getting a little robbed. It's a little screwed. But the committee probably knows what they're going to do, and with that information, I mean, a 6-6 unranked team versus a 9-3, number 14 ranked team, I'm going to give this one to Florida. Close game, but I'm going to give it to Florida. The committee knows something we don't. And honestly, Florida beat Utah. Like, Florida's a good team. They've beaten teams. They've also lost to teams. Like, they've pulled some impressive wins, and they've also taken some disappointing losses. So they're a little inconsistent, but I do think they will be able to take down the Beavers. Marshall versus UConn, I feel like I had to talk about it. I'm going to give it to UConn just because I feel like this is just their year to bounce back from being such a terrible football team. They're just going to bounce back and win. Marshall took down Notre Dame this year, but ever since then, they just haven't looked as good as they did in that game. I think Notre Dame just really, I don't know how they lost that game. It's just really bad loss, but that's like all they have really standing for them. UConn took down Liberty, which was a surprising victory. That's like what UConn's got standing for them. So I'm going to give it to UConn. Liberty versus Toledo. Speaking of Liberty kind of fell apart. They fell apart. They were like a one-loss team. I think they were 8-1. And they kind of just shit the bed. They just fell apart. Starting with the loss to UConn, I don't know if there was any injuries. Then they lost to Virginia Tech. Then they got slaughtered by New Mexico State. Now they're playing Toledo. I'm going to give this one to Liberty in a bounce-back game. I do think that Liberty, they were a good team, and they still can be a good team as long as they execute and do these things right. Toledo could shut down Toledo and win this game. Baylor versus Air Force. Air Force is actually a surprisingly good team, but I think Baylor is just such a better team than what their record says, and they're going to shut out Air Force. Nothing else to be said. Nothing else. Wake versus Mizzou. Honestly, Wake fell on their face this season. Let's be real. At a time, I think they were ranked number 8. And they fell on their face, collapsed. And Missouri's pulled some impressive stuff. Like, they almost beat Georgia. They almost handed Georgia their first L. Can you believe that? Like, imagine Missouri wins that. Michigan's number 1 in the country. Like, I mean, Missouri almost pulled that. I think Missouri takes it. Missouri's been a very bad team for a very long time. So it would be nice to see them win a bowl game and show that their football program has a lot of potential. It's funny because, like, the opening game of the season, right, was Missouri versus Auburn. And oh boy, or no, That was like the fourth game of the season. And that was just a terrible game. Holy shit, was that terrible. And that was when I was like, dude, Missouri sucks. But then they went on to almost beat Georgia. Like, I don't know. So I think they could take down Wake. Wisconsin versus Oklahoma State. This is a very broken and heartbroken and just broken Oklahoma State team. Went from number 9 in the country with one loss to TCU to 7-5 because their whole team just received injuries. With that being said, I think they can put up some competition because Wisconsin's a lot worse than they were last season. I think maybe they'll put up some competition. There's even potential that Oklahoma State might win this game, but there's also potential that Wisconsin just kills them. I don't really know what's going on with Oklahoma State. It is very sad what has happened to this team, but I think Wisconsin will take this one. UCF versus Duke. Duke actually has been a surprisingly good team. They're 8-4. Like, that's not anything like Duke football. That last time we saw Duke play that good was like 2014. Or I don't know. That could be definitely wrong, but I say Duke takes this one. I actually had this at 22. Then I gave him another touchdown. Duke, I know UCF is good, but UCF really did not look good in that Tulane game. And honestly, now that they're going up against a Power 5 school that has played and won against good teams, I mean, I just think, UCF is not going to be able to win this game. Kansas versus Arkansas. Funny bowl game. You know, why not? Both the Kansases, I guess. Yeah, well, one of them is just going to slaughter the other. Kansas won their first 6 games, and then they just lost. Or no, they won like their first 5 games, then they lost to TCU. And then they had to beat one team, which didn't happen for a while. Right. They barely beat Duke by 8 points. Wait, where did they win? Oh, yeah, they beat Oklahoma State when Oklahoma State was just injured. And that was their game that got them into a bowl game. From there on, they got slaughtered from there on out. So, Kansas is a lot worse than we thought they were. And yeah, Arkansas should kill them, honestly. Oregon versus North Carolina. Oregon should absolutely destroy them as long as like Bo Nix and whatnot is playing. North Carolina is a shitty, sucky, bad team who pulled an ASU, honestly. Just one loss, and then they just took 3 losses at the end of the season. Just absolute disappointment for North Carolina fans. And then their basketball team also pulls the same shit and starts losing games. So North Carolina's terrible. Overrated as shit. I can't believe I even gave them hope. I hate myself for it. Oregon should absolutely destroy North Carolina. Texas Tech versus Ole Miss. I'm extremely hyped for this bowl game because, oh boy, Texas Tech is going to beat the crap out of Ole Miss. I believe Texas Tech is a better team than Ole Miss. Ole Miss, I just hope they lose. I just hate how overrated they were all season. They just, we knew it. They were undefeated. They just hadn't lost, and they got placed like number 9 or something like that. And now look at them. They're just 8-4, not even ranked. Just terrible. And because of that, I want them to lose. Syracuse versus Minnesota. Minnesota, they are 8-4. Yes. But they've also taken losses to like, they got slaughtered by Penn State. They barely beat Nebraska. They lost to Iowa. They barely beat Wisconsin. Like, I don't know, man. I just look at Minnesota and I say, you're not better than Syracuse. Even though as bad as Syracuse has turned out to be, I just don't see Minnesota as better. I just think Syracuse is going to just going to win it. Oklahoma versus Florida State. Another bowl game where I'm like, holy fuck, dude, this team is getting robbed. Like 6-6 Oklahoma versus 9-3, number 13 in the country, Florida State. But then again, it's like, okay, maybe the committee knows what they're talking about. Overtime, 45-42. If there's anything both of these teams have been known for all season, it has been shootouts. Almost every Oklahoma game has been a shootout because they have no defense. There was plenty of exceptions. But can you believe they were ranked number 6 at a time? Oh my God. Kansas State barely beat them. TCU killed them. Texas slaughtered them 49-0. Forgot about that. And then they had a shootout with Kansas. They had a very defensive game against Iowa State. Then they had a shootout with Baylor. Then they didn't have a shootout against West Virginia because that was a very rainy game. And then they dropped 28 points on Oklahoma State and said, "We out." That was it for that game. And then they lost in overtime to Texas Tech in a shootout. There are plenty of their games this season. Also, the Kansas State game was a shootout. Like, plenty of their games this season have been shootouts. Games that they weren't shootouts were against more defensive teams, I would say. And Florida State, same thing goes for Florida State. They've dropped loads of points on many teams. 24-23 against LSU. That was a defensive game. Shootout against Louisville. They lost by 10 points to Wake. They let NC State come back and win that game. They barely lost to Clemson. Killed Georgia Tech. Killed Miami. Killed Syracuse. All in shootouts. Or not shootouts, but like they dropped many points. Then they slaughtered Louisiana. And then in a shootout against Florida. Florida State's offense looks very explosive. Their defense is not. Oklahoma's offense looks explosive. Their defense is not. This is going to be a shootout. Texas versus Washington, another game that I'm like, dude, Washington's getting robbed. But again, the committee definitely knows what they're doing, placing Texas against Washington. They did the same thing with 7-5 Texas going up against 11-2 Utah, and Texas slaughtered them. So I'm going to give this one to Texas with that knowledge and with the history. I get Michael Penix is good and whatnot, but Texas is an actual defense, and they're not a Pac-12 team. So, I just don't know if they're going to be able to win it. And after all, this Washington team did lose to ASU. ASU sucked dick this season, apparently. Our defense was so terrible, and our offense was pretty mid, and we managed to drop 45 points on them. So, Washington, I don't know. Maryland versus NC State, a game I'm super excited for because Maryland, I forgot to put the ranking, number 23 next to NC State, because Maryland has been so bad for so long, and this season they were good. They could have been a lot better. They lost a lot of close games, but they also won a lot of close games, and I think Maryland will take this one in a very close game. I just don't know if NC State can do it. NC State's kind of fallen apart since the start of the season. Pitt versus UCLA. I'm going to give this one to UCLA. I mean, Pitt hasn't done really anything all season, really. Their best win, their best game was in overtime with Tennessee, which was at Pitt at the time. And yeah, Tennessee just kind of struggled. Let's see how many turnovers there were. Both teams had 2. They had equal amounts of offensive yards, but Pitt had 35 minutes. Tennessee had 25, so that's the difference. Pitt also barely beat West Virginia. Georgia Tech beat them. What the hell? Then they beat the crap out of Virginia Tech. Louisville beat them. North Carolina beat the crap out of them. Then they beat Syracuse at home by 10 points. Then they slaughtered Virginia. Barely beat Duke by 2 points, and then slaughtered Miami. Pitt's a bad team, dude. And UCLA, I mean, look at who UCLA's beaten. UCLA's beaten Utah, Washington. They put 30 points down on Oregon, slaughtered Stanford, won by 14 to ASU in a game that ASU almost came back in. And then they took an upset loss against U of A, lost by 3 points to USC, barely beat Cal by 7. And now I just think UCLA is going to beat the crap out of this team. Notre Dame, South Carolina. This is South Carolina's game. There will be no Spencer Rattler mistakes. Both of these teams have very explosive offenses and kind of shaky defenses, so this will probably be a shootout. Tennessee versus Clemson. Dude, no doubt in my mind Tennessee fucking dominates this game. No doubt in my mind Tennessee shuts Clemson out in this game, especially after the fact that, dude, Clemson lost to South Carolina, and South Carolina has been beaten up by some SEC teams this year. Like, I just think that Tennessee is going to slaughter them. Bama versus Kansas State, probably the best game to come out of every single game. More hype than the Rose Bowl, more hype than TCU versus Michigan, more hype than Georgia versus Ohio State, more hype than Tulane versus USC. I mean, Kansas State versus Alabama was just such a perfect matchup. Two very good offenses, and actually very good defenses too. It's going to be a close one, let me tell you this. Alabama deserves it because they've lost a lot of close games this season, and they've barely won a lot of games. Kansas State is a very good team, but just not quite good enough to take down Bama. Iowa versus Kentucky. Kentucky should dominate. Iowa's a bad team. I'll give Iowa some points because Kentucky's been a little shaky on the defense, but, there's no room for, it's Iowa. Iowa's terrible. Can't believe they're even 7-5 right now. TCU versus Michigan. I'm going to give it to Michigan. I think TCU in that loss to Kansas State, you just can't play. You can't play catch up against these top teams. And honestly, I think Michigan's defense is actually pretty good, and their offense is very explosive. I just don't think TCU will be able to handle it. Ohio State versus Georgia. Georgia's going to win this one. Even if Georgia keeps it close, it slips up sometimes, I think Georgia will dominate. Ohio State's very extremely overrated. Nothing else to be said except for Bennett is going to win the Heisman. LSU versus Purdue. Give me Purdue. Give me Purdue. I don't know what's going on with Jaden Daniels, if he was just faking an injury because he got lifted up with one arm, which I don't know why everybody's giving Jaden Daniels so much hate for being lifted up by one arm. It's so much embarrassment. Y'all, did you look at him and be like, oh, he's a heavy dude? Like, he's so skinny. Like, you can't blame him. He's a 300-pound fucking defensive lineman. If he can't pick up Jaden Daniels, I don't know what can. Like, that was just a fucked up move by the Georgia defensive lineman to pick him up with one arm, honestly. It's just humiliating. And honestly, it was pretty fucked up to see that. Because it's just like, dude, you're 5,000 times bigger than him. You're a defensive lineman, and you're going to be a fat ass when you leave the league. You're going to be fucking gigantic when you're out of college football or the NFL, wherever you go. You're going to be fat as shit for the rest of your life because you set yourself up like that. You can make fun of Jaden Daniels for being skinny all he wants, but it's not like the kid can do much about it. He's a quarterback. Quarterbacks have to remain at a certain weight. And honestly, he's a running quarterback, so he can't just put on a bunch of weight. But anyways, besides that rant, Purdue put up a good competition against Michigan. A pick pretty much sealed their fate in that game. And a long drive by Michigan also sealed their fate. And LSU put up 30 points against Georgia. So I think this is a pretty good bowl game. Mississippi State versus Illinois. Give me Illinois. Illinois' got a pretty good defense. Mississippi State's got a very good offense, but I'm not too sure. When they play against good teams, their offense doesn't do a whole lot. And we know Illinois is a good team. They played Michigan to 2 points at Michigan. And I think the Illinois run game is just going to kill them. Tulane versus USC. If the Kansas State-Alabama game isn't the game of the year, this is, baby. Tulane. Tulane's going to get slaughtered. If Caleb Williams is back in. If Caleb Williams is still hurt and hobbled, or if he even decides to play, I don't even know if he decides to play or not. USC should shut out Tulane. It's an AAC team, let's be real, and USC should be in the college football playoffs right now, but their season got shit on by an injury, just like Oklahoma State. That's just how the game works. Just how it is. So, with that being said, Tulane will put up some points, but USC's offense will just be too good, I believe. Penn State versus Utah, our final game to talk about. I think Utah wins this time. Penn State is very overrated. Let's be real. Half the time they've won their games in dominations because it's been at Penn State. That's literally the only reason. They shut out Maryland because it was at Penn State. They put up points. Oh my God, I love tapping on the music ad. It's so awesome. They got ranked as high as they did at number 14 because they beat the crap out of a terrible Auburn team. They did beat Purdue, which Purdue should have won that game, but they sold it the last second. I mean, a very sad loss for Purdue in a game they should have very easily won, but they lost it at the last second. Penn State barely beat Northwestern. Penn State got shut out by Michigan, and they pretty much only put up points against teams if it's at home. So I just don't think – I think they'll have fans at the Rose Bowl. And, yes, I do believe Utah can be a pretty shaky team at times, but I believe Utah will win this one. This might even be, like, at a time, like 28-45, like, especially with the way they just handled – they beat USC, and then they beat him again. I won't give them much credit for beating USC with an injured Caleb Williams because, I mean, let's be real. Last time the score was around the same, 43-42. This time it was 47-24. If Caleb Williams was in, it probably would have been like right around the same score, like 49-47 or something like that. Maybe 42-47. I don't know. But anyways, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm talking about at this point. Comment, tell me what you think. Like and subscribe because that's very cool and epic. That's all for me. Adios.